Hello, learners. I welcome you to the first lecture of week 4 in the course Environmental Politics, Theories, Concepts, and Debates. In this week, we will discuss environmental movements in India. Uh, this is the first lecture, and today we will talk about the conceptual framework. So, the topic of today's lecture is Environmental Movements in India, a Conceptual Framework. The basic objective of today's lecture is to understand the nature of environmental movement in India and also to understand that what can be called the distinct features of Indian environmentalism. You see, when we talk about environmental movements in India and when we see around us, we can find that number of environmental movements, campaigns, protests are going in different parts of the country, and they all are very different in terms of the issues, in terms of strategies, in terms of ideologies, as well as organizational framework. And therefore it becomes very important to have a conceptual framework to comprehend this diverse nature of environmental movement in India. So, because it is the first lecture of the week, so I'll give you a brief outline of the week. So, these are the aspects which we are going to cover in this fourth week. Now, coming to the today's lecture. This is the outline of this lecture, and we are going to cover these aspects in today's lecture. So, to begin with the context of emergence of environmental movements in India. You see, during 1970s in India, an upsurge in people's movement was observed due to various factors. We need to understand what were those factors which were responsible for this upsurge in people's movement in India. You see, it was almost 2 decades after the independence. So the first decade can be called a kind of emotional phase where we were very happy that we are ruled by our own government. And this is, you see, it happens with most of the colonial countries. But by the second decade, a kind of critical approach started developing. It was also observed that some of the policies of government of India appear to be a kind of continuation of colonial policies. And gradually, because after 2 decades of being governed in a democratic framework, that sense of democratic participation also increased. Now, people realize that democratic participation doesn't mean only casting vote, it needs deeper participation. And at the same time, there was a kind of growing awareness about people's power, especially among the groups at the fringes, like women, peasants, tribal groups. So, this is the context which can be called responsible for upsurge in people's movement during 1970s. Rajni Kothari argues that these people's movement reflect the process of democratic churning, where deprived groups started coming forward to resist against the state. In the context of environmental movements, there were resistance against modernist development models, which were damaging ecological balance, at the same time depriving the interest of the marginal communities. The initial environmental policies appear to be influenced by Western model of environmentalism, where there was a lot of emphasis on increasing green cover and construction of wildlife sanctuaries. So gradually, the people who were at the fringes, they started demanding that their needs and concerns should be included in the conservation policy. And this led to a major shift in the whole scenario. So, if we talk about the origin of concern for environmental protection in the independent India, you see its roots can be traced in the 20th century British rule. Because there was number of protests against the commercialization of forest resources during British colonial period. But when we talk about a kind of organized awareness, we can say it started in 1970s. Like Sahu says that it was only in the 1970s a coherent and relatively organized awareness of the ecological impact of state monolithic development process started to develop, to grow into a full-fledged understanding of the limited nature of natural resources and to prevent the depletion of natural resources. So you see, because in the 1970 there was a kind of global awareness about ecological impact of the policies and program. And in the Indian context, we can say that all those policies which were developed during colonial age, and it started showing its negative impact on ecology by 1960s. And then people realized that they need to come forward to protect environment. At the same time, they could understand it very well that there is a close connection between their well-being and environmental well-being. So this can be called the context of emergence of environmental movements in India during 1970s. Now, about the origin of environmental movement in India, Ramchandra Guha says that 1973 proved to be a turning point in the history of environmentalism in India. He says three major events took place which led to an organized voice for environmental protection. You see, it is very interesting that these three events were very different in nature, but somehow they together, according to Goha, created a background for emergence of this organized voice. First event, according to Guha, was announcement of the Project Tiger by the government of India to save tigers. The project was launched as a result of the efforts of the international agencies like World Wildlife Fund and International Union for the Conservation of Nature to create a network of national parks and sanctuaries all over India to protect endangered wildlife. But this project has another side too. In the process of developing this project, in the process of building national parks and sanctuaries, there were a number of cases where rural people got displaced. And that became a very important issue of hesitation. Second, the publication of B.B. Vora's article, A Charter for the Land. This article got published in Economic and Political Weekly, and B.B. Vora happened to be a high official in the Ministry of Agriculture. In this article, he drew attention to the deplorable state of ecological degradation in India. And he emphasized that there is a need to develop an effective policy by the Indian state. It led to the creation of National Committee for Environmental Protection and Control in the same year. In 1980, the Department of Environment got established and Ministry of Environment and Forests came in existence after 5 years. So you see, this article is very, very important because this was the first article where the government has taken interest and in fact had paid attention to this deplorable state of ecological degradation. And third event was launch of Chipko movement in 1973, which spoke of the people's power, which spoke of the changed perspective of the people as well as their change in perception. So this, according to Guha, these three events led to origin of environmental movements in India, especially in 1970s. Now we'll talk about the nature of the environmental movement in India. You see, in the beginning only I said that environmental movement in India are full of diversity. So we will try to understand in general what can be called the nature of environmental movement. So the majority of environmental movements in India have been launched by ecosystem people rather than the biosphere people. That means most of the movements have been launched by the people at the fringes who immediately got impacted by ecological destruction or ecological imbalances. Second, these movements also speak of people's power. Why? Because most of these movements have involved the marginalized sections like women, poor, tribal groups, and also the other disadvantaged group. This is very interesting to observe that the participants in these movements, they come from different social backgrounds, and when they come from different social background, they also bring their values, their perception with them, and this has led to diverse forms of activism like movements of tribal groups, peasants, and movements by urban middle class for pollution control, urban planning, and sustainable development. When you observe these movements and campaigns, you will find there is very much difference in terms of forms of activism adopted by these groups. Now, environmental movements in India also represent vast regional and geographical diversity that emerge from different ecological zones because they each of them face unique environmental challenges. In terms of ideology, also, Indian environmental movement are heterogeneous. And what is very interesting to observe, you see, that there are movements where more than one ideology were at play. Like if I can give you an example of Chipko movement. So broadly, it was a movement based on Gandhian ideology. But there were some differences in the ideological framework of Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna. Both of them were Gandhian. But if you compare, then you can find that the approach and ideology of Chandi Prasad Bhatt was comparatively pragmatic. Similarly, when we talk about the Silent Valley movement, there also you can find that on the one hand, Marxist ideology was working, and on the other hand, even the Gandhian framework was working. So, in terms of ideology, these movements are very, very diverse. Similarly, in terms of issues, also, there are issues from forest preservation and anti dam movements to urban pollution and industrial disasters. Another very important feature is their relation with the state. In this context, also, we can observe diversity. There are movements and groups who prefer to collaborate with the state and judiciary to bring change. And there are others who believe in direct action method. They directly oppose the governmental development policies through mass mobilization. So, on the basis of this, we can understand that one feature of environmental movements in India can be that it is full of diversity. And you see, it speaks of richness of environmental movements in India. You cannot understand these environmental movements through a kind of monolithic framework. Now, this map is very interesting. I have taken it from PP Karan's article. This map will help you to understand the spread of environmental movements in India. Mainly, this map represent major movements which took place from 1970s to 80s and late 80s maybe. And you see these movements are covering the every part of India. So we'll begin with the northern part. In the northern part, you can say in Uttarakhand there was Chipko movement. It was a forest based movement. Then there was movement against limestone quarrying in Doon Valley, and there was a movement against Tehri Dam. So this is the northern part. Now come to the western part. These three major states, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. You see, these three are connected with one very, very important movement, that was Save Narmada movement. It was an anti-dam movement. Now come to the eastern part. This is a movement against Gumti Dam in Tripura. Then this is a movement by youth and tribal groups opposing bauxite mining in Gandhamardhan Hills of Odisha. Now come down, and this is another very important movement by tribal groups again against Balipal and Bhogarai test range. So it is a movement against a test range. Now come to the south. There are three major movements. One was campaign against Kaga nuclear power plant in Karnataka. Then Apiko movement. It was also a forest movement in Karnataka, and now in the Malabar region, Silent Valley movement, which was a movement against hydroelectric project. You see, very interesting feature of this map is that if you can see here Chipko movement, it directly inspired Apiko movement. So this map speaks of the fact that how these movements are also interconnected, how they inspire each other. Now coming to the classification of environmental movements in India. We'll do this classification on the basis of the issues of the movement. The first category can be called forest and land based. Basically, the major issues raised by this kind of movement are access to forest resources, non-commercial use of natural resources, prevention of land degradation, social justice. Some of the major movement of this category are here. Chipko movement, Apiko movement. Second category is marine resources and fisheries and aquaculture. These movements are mainly focused on issues like ban on trawling, preventing commercialization of shrimp and prawn culture, protection of marine resources. Some of the very important campaigns and movements related to this category are National Fishermen Forum working for traditional fisher folk of Kerala, Chilka Bachao Andolan in Odisha. Third category is very, very important, industrial pollution. These movements raise issues like stricter pollution control measure, compensation for the victims, and prevention of reckless expansion of industries. One very important campaign and movement associated with this is Zehreeli Gas Morcha in Bhopal. You all must have heard about the Bhopal gas tragedy. So this group basically is fighting for compensation for the victims. And there are other large number of movements associated with the issue of industrial pollution. Now, the movement against development project. You see, most of these movements would raise two issues. One, ecological balance, and second, rehabilitation, resettlement of the displaced. So, first in this category can be called movements against dam and irrigation project, like Narmada Bachao Andolan or the movement against Tehri Dam. Then second is movements against power projects. Same issue are raised by them, like Jan Andolan in Dabhol against Enron. Third one is movement against mining project. Their main focus is on depletion of natural resources. As we had seen just now, anti-mine project in Doon Valley, anti-bauxite mine movement in Odisha. Fourth category is industrial plant, railway project, airport project. So the campaign and movements which are against these projects. They also raise the same issue, land degradation, ecological imbalance, rehabilitation and resettlement. One very important movement in this category is protest and demands of Konkan Railway Realignment Action Committee. Then the movement against military base. It also talk about the issue of safety, along with ecological balance, rehabilitation and resettlement. Some important campaign and movements are here, like anti-missile test range in Balipal, Odisha and Netherhat, Bihar. Then there are movements against wildlife sanctuaries and national parks, as we discussed in the beginning only. Because these sanctuaries, these national parks, also, on the one hand, it contributed in increasing the green cover and protecting the wildlife, but at the same time had led to displacement, and therefore, these movement raised the issue of rehabilitation and resettlement. Like very important movement associated with this is Ekjut in Bhima Shankar region of Maharashtra. Tourism. This category is again very important because the movement against tourism project talk about displacement but also about the cultural changes, ecological imbalances and also social ills. Recently we have seen number of campaigns in Himachal Pradesh and even Uttarakhand because increasing tourism is putting a lot of pressure on ecology of these places like Himachal Bachao Andolan. Then there is this category advocacy groups, individual campaigns, and citizens action groups. They basically raise the issue of clear policy on national park and wildlife sanctuaries, lobbying, research, training. These are their methods. And these are some of the important groups which are associated with this. Then another category is appropriate technology, organic farming. They basically raise the issue of sustainable development. They do talk about eco-friendly models of development. They do talk about environmental friendly housing and technology. And one very important example is Ralegaon Siddhi. So you see, through this table, we have understood that in terms of issues, Indian environmental movement represent vast range of diversity. Now moving ahead, we'll talk about the ideological spectrum of environmental movements in India. You see, there can be two ways. One, we can do like we can try to understand Indian environmental movements in terms of deep ecology, shallow ecology, prudential anthropocentrism. Here we will try to understand the classification given by Gadgil and Guha, where they suggest that the Indian environmental movements broadly represent five ideological strands. Now we'll see what are those five ideological strands. First is crusading Gandhians. According to Guha, this ideological framework, in the process of understanding ecological degradation and ecological imbalances, raise moral questions, raise ethical questions, and suggest for a kind of alternative framework. They are very, very critical of modernist way of development. Their argument is what? That these modernist way of development is a kind of imposition of Western framework, which nowhere matches with the Eastern perspective. So they say there should be a moral regeneration. And how can that be possible? By an alternative, non modern philosophy whose roots lie in Indian tradition. Second ideological framework, according to Guha and Gadgil, is ecological Marxist, who see the problem in political and economic terms. Their argument is that the unequal access to resource rather than the question of values can explain the patterns and processes of environmental degradation in India. Their argument is that in the sharply stratified Indian society, the root of ecological imbalances are in the unequal socio political and economic structures. They say rich destroy nature in the pursuit of profit, while the poor do so simply to survive. Another ideological framework is appropriate technology. They strive for a working synthesis of agriculture and industry, big and small units, and Western and Eastern technological traditions. So they do not talk about deeper changes or systemic changes. They are more interested in suggesting a set of socio technical alternatives to the centralizing and environmentally degrading technologies. They say the present framework of technology which we are adopting, they are degrading technologies. They can be called anti environment technology. So we need to replace this technology with a new set of technology which can be in tune with the environmental needs and well-being. Fourth is wilderness enthusiast. Their main focus is protection of wilderness. Their concern is decline of natural forest and their plants and animal species, and therefore they urge government to take remedial action. So they attempt to have a kind of extensive system of parks and sanctuaries, and they want a total ban on human activity in protected areas. So you see, it can be seen a kind of impact of the deep ecology. And fifth one is scientific conservation. Their major concern is with efficiency and management of natural resources. So according to Guha and Gadgil, the environmental movements in India can be seen in terms of these five ideological perspectives. Now, coming to the organizational framework, this is also diversified, which involves various organizations from very loosely organized grassroots groups to the national and international networks, like grassroots organizations and community movements. These are often led by local communities, like Chipko movement, Apiko movement. Then there are movements of tribals and indigenous communities and groups to protect their customary right and registering against deforestation, mining, and displacement. Then non-governmental organization and advocacy group. You see, in India, the role of NGO has been very, very significant in the environmental movements in terms of making people aware, mobilizing people, organizing environmental protest and campaigns, and also conducting survey and research and engage in policy advocacy. So we can say that NGOs play the role of a link between communities, governments, and international organizations. Next kind of organization which are very, very active in environmental movement are student and youth groups. And recently their role has been increased. What they do in the present time, they make optimum use of social media and digital platforms to mobilize support, like Fridays for Future in India, which is inspired by Greta Thunberg's global climate strike movement. Similarly, Let India Breathe. This is also a digital environmental campaign which focuses on deforestation, pollution, and climate policy awareness. Now, coming to the strategy. Environmental movements in India, you see, employ a plethora of strategies from grassroots activism and legal interventions to digital campaign and policy advocacy. One dominant strategy in the Indian environmental movement has been non-violent protest and civil disobedience. Then second is grassroots mobilization and community participation. It mainly emphasizes participatory decision making and decentralized governance. Another very important strategy is media and digital activism. It is a recent strategy where digital platforms are used to create awareness, mobilize public support, and creating pressure on policymakers. And it is often used by the youth and student. But you see, even in the present time, other kind of campaigns are also using these mediums. Then policy advocacy and negotiation with government for sustainable development policies and stricter environmental regulation. When all the above method fail, then the method of direct action is also used by some of the groups and movements. And then alliance with international organization. There have been number of movements where we had seen that the help of the international organization has been taken to create international pressure on the government and industries. Like we'll see the case of Narmada Bachao Andolan, we'll see the case of Silent Valley movement. So there are movements which collaborate with global institutions to gain support and funding. You see, these methods are used by different movements, and we cannot say that one movement use only one method. It's a kind of mixture of different methods. So through this we can understand that how diverse environmental movements in India are in terms of strategies. These are the references that I have used in my lecture. You can go through it for having a deeper understanding of the nature of environmental movement in India. These are the activity questions which you are expected to complete after going through the lecture. So, thank you, learners. Today we discussed about the nature of environmental movement in India. We discussed how diverse is Indian environmental movement in terms of strategy, in terms of issues, in terms of organizational framework, and also ideology. I believe that this lecture would help you to understand the coming lectures of the week. At the same time, it would also help you to compare the nature of Indian environmentalism with the Western environmentalism. Thank you very much for joining the lecture.